I don't talk about that September often. Back then, I had already spent nearly a decade working as a ranger. I thought I'd seen every shape danger could take in the wilderness. Bears tearing into trash cans behind campgrounds. Coyotes pushing their luck around fishermen's coolers. The dull chaos of forest, fires flaring without warning. And of course, the grim task of hiking out into the dark after a tourist failed to return. None of it ever surprised me. Nature followed rules even when it looked violent. But the night I was called above the McCloud River in Northern California, I realized there's a line out there one you don't know exists until you've crossed it. A line where the usual explanations no longer work. It was the last breath of summer slipping into the first chill of autumn. That part of California near Shasta feels heavy with seasons in a way you can't explain until you've lived it. By day, the dust of logging trucks hangs over the road in pale sheets. At night, air cold enough to sting your lungs falls down from the mountain, where stubborn snow still clings in ridges of volcanic rock. My patrols had been ordinary for weeks. Closing up roads, checking campsites, logging maintenance. No big fires, no emergencies. The radio stayed quiet. I had started to think that this season might pass without a single hard call. I was wrong. The report came in close to midnight. A man had stumbled down to a communications station, pale and frantic. He said he'd heard screams in the forest above McCloud, where an old, unofficial campground still sat along a half-forgotten road. He'd found tents torn apart, trees split open, not by wind, not by weather. He'd smelled something sharp, wet, unpleasant, like a basement that had been underwater for too long. That's the kind of detail you don't forget. Protocol said it was probably a bear. They'd push into food, scatter people, leave a mess behind. But the way the tourist described it, something didn't match. I loaded up the service truck rifle, flares, bear spray, heavy flashlight, first aid, checked the batteries twice. I clicked the emergency beacon on and drove north, the suspension shuddering over every rut. The turnoff to the old road was worse roots breaking through the dirt, black puddles in the dips. I had to drop into low gear just to keep moving forward. By the time I reached the site, my headlights fell across a scene that wasn't right. 2 campfires cold and ringed with stone. A picnic table stained gray by sun and rain. Tent fabric sagging like it had been yanked apart, not cut, not ripped by claws, but pulled sideways with force. The aluminum frame lay folded, bent like a child had snapped it across their knee. And then the tree. A fresh gash scored into the bark, more than a foot higher than I could reach with my arm raised. Not lightning, not a tool. The bark was shredded outward, as if something enormous had slammed against it. I stepped out of the truck, left the lights on. I couldn't stomach the thought of standing in complete darkness. The ground was soft enough to hold its memory, and everywhere I looked, the soil told a story. The deep tread of boots near one tent. A scatter of heel marks that looked like panic people running. But farther out, at the edge where the shadows thickened, were impressions I couldn't make sense of. Wide, bare, longer than any foot I'd ever seen. I crouched down, pressed my hand flat against the print. My palm didn't even cover the width. There was a ridge across the arch, pressed down like something heavy had flexed there. Too exact to be erosion, too real to be a trick of the ground. I photographed it anyway, measuring tape laid beside it, telling myself it would make sense in daylight. But even in that moment, something in my body knew better. The smell was still there, too, like damp fabric rotting in a basement, mixed with the sharp tang of something electrical. It lingered without moving, as though the air itself was holding it in place. I wrote it into memory and moved on. I circled wide with my flashlight, cutting through trunks and brush. Every sound seemed magnified cones tumbling from high branches, dry twigs snapping under my boots. Then came the voice. I'd been warned about mountain lions. I'd heard their cries before. This was not that. It rose from somewhere deep, too low for an animal, then bent high until it sliced into a pitch that prickled the nerves at the base of my neck. It carried shape, but no words. A sound designed not for communication, but for claiming. My hands shook on the rifle, not from volume, but because the sound had no place. Nothing I knew could make it. It called again, this time from another direction, and again, closer. I lifted the rifle and did what I was trained to do, fired a warning shot. The crack slapped the forest, rolled down into the valley, faded, but the woods didn't change. No scatter of hooves, no startled wings. Nothing fled. And then I saw it. Between two old Douglas firs stood a figure I will never forget. Taller than anyone I had ever seen, shoulders wide as a doorway, body straight without the curve of a waist. Dark, heavy fur that caught no light, as if it swallowed the beam of my flashlight. Its arms swung low, longer than they should, ending in hands that weren't paws. The head large, ridged hair matted across the crown. I never saw its face fully, only the silhouette, and that was enough. It didn't hide. It didn't pause. It stepped toward me, slow but deliberate, as though the forest belonged to it, and I was nothing more than a trespasser. I fired again, this time into the dirt beside me, sending up a spray of dust. The figure didn't falter. It picked up pace, a steady, impossible weight pressing through the earth with each step. I backed away, aiming toward the road, but it was too late. Something slammed into me from the left, not a tackle, not a fall, a strike with the weight of a truck bed moving downhill. My chest folded in on itself, my ribs lit with pain. I hit the gravel, breath ripped out, head ringing. The flashlight flew from my grip, beam rolling wild across the ground. My rifle skidded under the picnic table, and then it was above me, a silhouette that didn't belong. The mass of it blocked the stars. Its outline seemed larger than the trees themselves. Dust swirled in a gust that came only from its movement. Instinct saved me. My hand found the flare on my vest, pulled, snapped, and fired it upward. Red light burst across the clearing, staining the pines in a bloody haze. For one long second I saw it in full color. It stepped back, head tilted, body tense as though the blow offended it. It turned from me, pushed into the slope, and disappeared not with speed, but with a force so absolute that every tree in its path groaned as if bending to let it through. When the flare dimmed, I was alone. I lay on my side, ribs screaming, lungs burning with each shallow breath. I told myself to stay conscious, to remember the first aid kit in the truck, to crawl if I had to. I made it somehow, hauled myself into the cab, flipped on the hazards, called the coordinates. Sat there gripping my chest with one hand so the pain didn't take me under. And while I waited for the others to come, I realized something I haven't shaken since. There are things in these forests that don't fear us. Things that don't bend to rifles or flares or the rules we think keep us safe. That was the night I learned I wasn't in control out there, and I never was. They found me slumped over the steering wheel. 2 rangers I'd known for years, guys who had seen me hike 50 miles with a busted ankle. Guys who thought I was the steady one dragged me out of the truck and laid me in the dirt like I was another casualty of the forest. I could hear them talking, their voices muffled like I was underwater. One said, "Bear attack." The other said, "Fall." Neither of them wanted to write the truth on the report. Not when the truth had no words we could stamp on paper. I remember the drive out in fragments. The radio chatter, the siren flashing across pine trunks, the pain climbing higher each time the road jarred my ribs. In the hospital, they wrapped me in white sheets, measured fractures like tally marks. 4 ribs gone, bruising across the sternum, concussion. The kind of damage you expect when a man collides with a car, not when he's standing still in the woods. They asked me questions. How did you fall? Where was the bear? What did you see? And each time I felt the same weight pressing down, not just in my chest, but in the room. A pressure, invisible but heavy. If I said what I'd really seen, it wouldn't be taken as truth. It would be treated as sickness. So I lied, said I'd lost my footing near the gash-marked tree. Said maybe I startled a bear, maybe it clipped me on the way out. I kept my face blank. I nodded when the wildlife officer reminded me that adrenaline can twist memory, that shock makes the mind invent details. But when the officer left the room, one of the nurses stayed behind, a quiet man with tired eyes. He waited until the door clicked shut, and then he leaned close enough that I smelled the coffee on his breath. "You don't have to say it out loud," he whispered. "But I've seen the same thing." That was all. No explanation, no story, no name. He walked out before I could ask him what he meant. I lay there for 3 nights, listening to the monitors tick out their rhythm, wondering what he had seen, wondering if he'd stood where I stood, under the weight of that shadow that didn't belong. When they discharged me, I was ordered to take leave. Desk duty, minimum. My superiors filed the case under unconfirmed wildlife activity. It was easier that way. Paperwork prefers simplicity, but the forest doesn't. I drove back to McLeod within a week against orders. I told myself it was to collect personal gear I'd left behind, but the truth was uglier. I had to know if the clearing looked the same in daylight, or if it had already rearranged itself into something explainable. The road was quieter this time. Birds darted overhead. Sunlight trickled between firs in gentle columns. The forest looked innocent. When I reached the old campsite, the tents were gone, cleared by staff. Picnic table hauled away. No trace of the panic that had hung there like fog. But the prints remained. Not all of them, most had blurred, softened by weather, but one survived in the shade, deeper than the rest. I crouched over it, pressing the tape against the soil again. 14 inches from heel to toe, nearly twice the width of my own boot. And here's the part that has never let me sleep since. Beside it, faint but undeniable, was another, smaller. Not small enough to be human, not large enough to be the same one I'd seen. A second print, a second presence. The thought hit me like cold water. This wasn't an isolated thing. If there was one, there were more. I stood up fast, too fast, ribs aching. My flashlight wasn't with me this time, only daylight, but for a moment the air carried the same stillness. That silence before a storm. And then, far down the slope, a crack, not a branch falling. A wait. I turned, scanning tree lines, waiting for the shape that didn't belong. Nothing moved. Still, I knew I wasn't alone. I forced myself back to the truck, slammed the door, locked it, sat gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I drove away without looking back, telling myself that was it. But the truth is, I didn't leave it behind. It followed, not literally, not steps behind me on the road. Something deeper, a pressure, a sense. I felt it in my house at night when the wind caught the roof beams wrong. I felt it when I walked into the ranger station and saw the way my coworkers looked at me, like they knew I was carrying something I wouldn't share. 2 weeks later, a hunter went missing 15 miles east of McLeod. A seasoned man, local. His brother found his rifle propped against a tree, scope snapped in half. No blood, no tracks, no body. The official story blamed a cougar. But I drove out there anyway, ribs still bound under my shirt, against every order. And I found the same smell. The same stench of rot mixed with something sharp and metallic. That was the moment I knew. It wasn't a one-time event. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my concussion tricking me into shadows. It was real. And whatever it was still out there. I haven't spoken much about the weeks that followed. I was restless, sleepless, caught between obsession and fear. I read everything I could, old reports, native legends, handwritten notes buried in station archives. Most were fragments, hints, creatures glimpsed in fog, voices heard at night, prints erased by morning. One account stopped me cold. A ranger in the 1970s had filed a report about strange impressions near McLeod River after a series of disappearances. His note ended abruptly. No further investigation recommended. The file was stamped closed in red ink, but the signature at the bottom had been scratched out, as if someone didn't want the name remembered. That was the proof I needed. I wasn't the first, but I might be the last willing to admit it. I don't know what I saw that night in the clearing. I don't know if it was flesh or something older, something beyond names. But I know this. It wasn't done with me. Every time I close my eyes, I hear that voice again. The low growl that bends into a scream. The sound that doesn't communicate it claims. And sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I dream of the moment on the ground when I looked up and saw it blot out the stars. I wake gasping, ribs aching with memory, half expecting to smell that rot in the room. I can lie on paper. I can tell the reports what they want to hear. But in my bones, I know the truth. It saw me, and it hasn't forgotten. I stopped wearing the uniform after the second disappearance. Technically, I was still on the payroll. Desk work, paperwork, recovery time, they called it. But every time I buttoned that shirt, it felt like armor made of paper thin, useless, pretending at protection. So I left it hanging in the closet and started dressing like any other man on the street. Jeans, jacket, hat pulled low. Easier to blend in. Easier to ask questions without drawing the wrong kind of attention. Because by then I'd made a decision. If the department wouldn't investigate, I would. I started with maps. The ranger station kept archives stacked in metal cabinets, older than most of the staff. Reports, incident logs, survey notes. I spent nights in that room, the fluorescent light buzzing, tracing coordinates across yellowed paper. At first it looked random scattered marks of missing hiker, unconfirmed wildlife sighting, unresolved noise complaint. But when I pinned them to a wall-sized map, the pattern began to show itself. They circled McLeod, not perfectly, not geometric, but close enough to tighten my chest. A wide ring of vanishings and disturbances spanning decades. And in the center of that ring, the old campsite. The same place where I'd heard the scream. The same ground where I'd been struck down. I kept digging, found microfilm reels of local newspapers, tiny clippings about strange lights in the 1950s, unexplained hunter's death in the 1960s, children lost, later found claims of a tall figure in the woods in the early 80s. Each story was buried between grocery ads and livestock auctions, forgotten until I threaded them together like beads on a string. I even drove down to Reading to talk with an old man who'd written letters to the editor back in the day. He sat on his porch with oxygen tubes in his nose, hands shaking around a mug of weak coffee. When I asked about the letters, his eyes glazed, not with confusion, but with memory. "You've seen it too," he rasped. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He told me a story about fishing near Shasta in 1969. Said something had stood across the water, silent, unmoving, watching him until the sun went down. He never fished again. "They don't care about us," he whispered before his daughter came to take him inside. "They care about the land. And we're just noise on it." That line never left me. By November, my obsession had leaked into every part of my life. I'd drive the back roads at night, windows down, listening for that scream. I left recorders nailed to trees, came back to static so loud it made my ears ring. I started to believe the silence was worse than sound. And I wasn't alone. I began to notice things. A truck parked too long outside my house with the engine running. A black SUV on the highway mirror checking me for miles. Unmarked envelopes slipped under my door with nothing inside but blank paper. At first I thought paranoia was eating me alive. But then one morning I found my front gate left open padlock, unlatched, not broken. Someone had been inside my fence. Someone wanted me to know I was being watched. But by who? The government? Locals who'd kept the legend alive in whispers? Or something else entirely? Something that didn't use engines or padlocks at all? I couldn't tell anymore. And then came the call. Late November, just after Thanksgiving. A voice I didn't recognize, low, urgent. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop digging, or you won't be the only one hurt." The line went dead before I could ask who it was. The number was blocked. That night I sat in my dark kitchen with the curtains drawn, staring at the print I'd lifted from the dirt near McLeod, the 14-inch track pressed into soil. I'd traced its outline in ink, the arch, the toe span, the depth. My hand dwarfed by something that should not exist. And I realized something that hollowed me out. The warning wasn't from strangers. It was from someone who already knew the truth. Someone close enough to the land, close enough to the history, to want it buried again. That was the moment fear stopped being my main companion. Rage took its place. Because if these things, creatures, beings, whatever name you give them, had been here all along, then someone had been covering it up. Not for months, not for years, for lifetimes. I couldn't let it go, so I returned. One last time. December had pulled its grip over the forest. Snow hung in patches along the slope, crunching under my boots. Breath billowed like smoke. The trees seemed even taller without leaves to soften their lines, skeletal giants crowding around me. I carried nothing but a sidearm, a flare, and a recorder. No rifle. I knew it wouldn't matter. I hiked until I reached the clearing, the place of my collapse. At first, it was silent, just wind threading through branches. I planted the recorder in the soil, checked the battery, sat against a stump with my jacket pulled tight. Waiting. Minutes bled into hours. Cold bit at my fingers, toes numb in my boots. I thought maybe I'd imagined everything, that I'd wake to find myself frozen. Another statistic on a ranger's log. And then the forest changed. It wasn't sound, not at first. It was the pressure. That same heavy stillness that had wrapped around me in September. The air thickening, as though the trees were leaning in, listening. The smell followed. Damp rot, metal, electricity. And then, just beyond the reach of moonlight, I heard it. A footstep, heavy, deliberate. Then another, and another. Slow, steady, circling. I gripped the flare in my pocket, thumb brushing the striker, every muscle in my body drawn tight. The steps stopped. I lifted my eyes, and there between two skeletal trunks stood the silhouette again. Taller this time, or maybe closer. Massive, head tilted as though studying me. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, half-hidden, smaller shapes shifted in the dark. Not one, not two more. Watching, waiting. The flare trembled in my hand, but I didn't strike it. Not yet, because for the first time I wasn't sure light would send them away. And as the recorder blinked red at my feet, capturing every breath, every movement, I realized something chilling. They hadn't come to chase me off. They'd come to see if I would run.